Before we continue, please be aware that this video is based solely on publicly available information, including court documents and verified news reports. All details presented are factual and derived from credible sources. Now let's return to the discussion. Los Angeles, California, January 15th, 1947, a Tuesday morning. A woman is walking her young child through a quiet neighborhood, just like any other day. But then she stops. She looks down at the grass near the sidewalk, and what she sees and will never leave her. A young woman, just 22 years old, had been found on an empty lot, carefully placed as if staged, with no identification, no fingerprints on record. No one nearby had heard a single thing. The city of Los Angeles had seen crime before, but nothing like this. And what came next would shake the entire nation. This is the story of a girl who just wanted to be somebody. A girl who left home chasing a dream and was never seen alive again. And 77 years later, nobody has ever been charged. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why this case is still one of the most haunting mysteries in American history, and why the answer may have been hiding in plain sight all along. The woman standing on that sidewalk that January morning was Betty Bersinger. She was 27 years old, a young housewife who had simply taken her 3-year-old daughter out for a morning walk. She had no idea that within the next few seconds, her life, and the life of an entire city, was about to change forever. What she had stumbled upon would ignite one of the largest, most exhausting, and most heartbreaking criminal investigations in American history. And the girl at the center of it all? Her name was Elizabeth Short, and this is the full story of what happened to her. Before we go any further, I want to ask you 3 questions. 3 questions that investigators, journalists, detectives, and ordinary people have been asking for nearly 8 decades. 3 questions that have never, not once, been officially answered. First, who had a reason to want Elizabeth Short dead, and how close were they to her in the weeks before she disappeared? Second, why did whoever did this go to such extraordinary methodical lengths? What were they so desperate to conceal? And third, did the Los Angeles Police Department actually get close to the truth? Close enough to name a suspect, and then deliberately look the other way? These are not small questions. These are not the kind of questions that get brushed aside with time. They are the questions that have kept this case alive for nearly 80 years. And by the time we reach the end of this story, you will have your own answer. I promise you that. But before we get to any suspects, before we get to the evidence, before we talk about what the LAPD knew and when they knew it, we need to go back. Back to a girl from Massachusetts. Back to a childhood marked by abandonment and heartbreak. Back to a young woman who arrived in Los Angeles carrying nothing but a suitcase, a dream, and an aching, desperate need to feel like she mattered. Because if you don't understand who Elizabeth Short was, really was, then none of what happened to her will make sense. And she deserves more than a headline. She always did. And before we go any further, we want to hear from you. Go ahead and drop in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now let's go back to the beginning. Elizabeth Short was born on July 29th, 1924, in Hyde Park, Massachusetts, a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Boston. She was the 3rd of 5 daughters born to Cleo Alvin Short and Phoebe May Sawyer. By every account, her early years were not extraordinary in any dramatic way. Her family was working class, living through the grinding difficulties of the Great Depression, doing what millions of American families were doing, holding on. Her father, Cleo, ran a miniature golf business, and like so many small business owners in that era, the crash hit him hard. When his finances collapsed and his world fell apart, Cleo Short did something that would define Elizabeth's childhood and cast a long shadow over every relationship she would ever have. He left. One day in 1930, when Elizabeth was just 6 years old, Cleo Short abandoned his car near a bridge in Massachusetts, leaving behind a note that suggested he had taken his own life. He was gone, and just like that, Elizabeth Short grew up believing her father was dead. Phoebe Short was now a single mother with 5 daughters and no financial safety net. The family struggled. They moved frequently. Elizabeth grew up watching her mother carry the weight of the entire household on her shoulders, and from a very young age she understood one thing deeply and painfully, that the people you love can simply vanish one day without warning. That understanding, that wound, would never entirely leave her. Friends who knew Elizabeth as a child described her as bright, cheerful, and striking even at a young age. She was the kind of girl who drew attention without trying. Dark hair, pale skin, vivid blue eyes, and a smile that people remembered. But beneath the surface, there was always a restlessness, a searching quality, as though she were constantly looking for something she couldn't quite name. That quality would define the rest of her life. As Elizabeth moved into her teenage years, her health became a serious concern. She suffered from chronic respiratory problems, bronchitis, and some accounts suggest early signs of a lung condition. And her doctors recommended that she spend time in warmer climates. So during the winters, she began traveling south to Florida, staying with family friends, working small jobs, living in boarding houses. She was still a teenager, largely on her own, navigating a world that offered young women very few protections and even fewer options. And yet, by every account, she managed. She was charming. She made friends easily. She had a gift for walking into a room and making people feel as though she had always been there. But she never stayed anywhere long enough to put down roots. That pattern, arriving somewhere full of hope, then moving on, became the defining rhythm of her life. And then something happened that changed everything. Elizabeth Short discovered that her father, Cleo Short, was not dead. He was alive. He had been alive the entire time. He had simply walked away from his family and started a new life in California, in Vallejo to be precise. Elizabeth, by then in her late teens, made contact with him. Despite everything, despite the abandonment, despite the years of believing he was gone, she reached out, and for a brief time, sometime around 1942, she went to California and lived with her father. It must have felt, at least for a moment, like a second chance, a reconciliation, a father and daughter piecing something back together. But it didn't last. Whatever she had hoped to find in Cleo Short, she did not find it. The relationship fractured. She left. And once again, Elizabeth Short was alone, starting over in a state she barely knew, a long way from home. The early 1940s in America were defined by one overwhelming reality: World War II. Hundreds of thousands of young men were shipping out across the Pacific and Atlantic, and the cities surrounding military bases became transient, electric, and sometimes dangerous places. Elizabeth Short drifted through several of them. She spent time in Camp Cook in California. She spent time in Santa Barbara, where in September 1943 she was actually arrested, at age 19, for underage drinking at a bar frequented by soldiers. She was not charged with anything serious and was released, but that arrest left a set of fingerprints on file. Fingerprints that would tragically become crucial years later in the most terrible of circumstances. During this period, Elizabeth worked odd jobs, waitressing mostly, and she dated. She dated soldiers, young men who were often heading overseas, men for whom every evening might be the last one they had on American soil. She fell in love quickly and completely, and she was let down. Again and again. By 1946, the war was over. The soldiers were coming home, and Los Angeles was in the middle of a transformation, from a sprawling, sun-soaked city into something approaching a genuine metropolis. Hollywood was booming. The film industry was producing pictures at a frantic pace, and for young women across the country, Los Angeles had become synonymous with reinvention, with possibility, with the idea that if you were beautiful enough and determined enough and willing to work hard enough, you could become something. Elizabeth Short believed that. She believed it completely. By the summer of 1946, she had made her way back to Los Angeles, this time with more intention, more focus, and a deeper sense that this was where her life was supposed to begin in earnest. She was 22 years old. She was, by every account, extraordinarily beautiful. And she was, as she had always been, completely alone. In Los Angeles, Elizabeth found a way to survive the way many young women in her position did, through the kindness of acquaintances, through rooming houses, through the informal networks of people chasing the same dream. For a period, she rented a room behind the Florentine Gardens nightclub on Hollywood Boulevard, working as a waitress, telling anyone who asked that she was going to be in pictures. She connected with a man named Mark Hansen, a wealthy nightclub and theater owner in Los Angeles, who had a loose arrangement by which he allowed young women, aspiring actresses and entertainers, to board at his home. Elizabeth stayed there for a time. Friends who saw her during this period described her as lively, funny, warm, the kind of person who could hold a table's attention without even trying. She dressed carefully, almost always in black. She had a flair for fashion that was unmistakable, and people loved her. But she could never seem to stay in one place. She moved between friends' homes, between rooming houses, always arriving with her suitcase and her smile, always leaving before she had to explain herself too deeply. In the final weeks of her life, Elizabeth Short was in San Diego. She had been staying with friends there, and she met a man named Robert Manley, known to almost everyone as Red because of his hair. Robert Manley was 25 years old, married, and a pipe clamp salesman. He met Elizabeth at a bar, and the two struck up a friendship that, by Manley's own account, he was warm but not romantic. He insisted later that he had simply taken a liking to her, that she was charming and lost-looking in equal measure, and that he had wanted to help her get back to Los Angeles. On January 8th and 9th, 1947, Manley drove Elizabeth Short from San Diego to Los Angeles. They stopped overnight, and on the afternoon of January 9th, 1947, Robert Red Manley dropped Elizabeth Short off at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. She told him she was meeting her sister. She stepped out of his car, walked into the Biltmore, and was never seen alive again. That was the last confirmed moment anyone can place Elizabeth Short in the living world. After that, 6 days of silence, 6 days that investigators have spent nearly 80 years trying to account for. Betty Bersinger had no reason to be afraid that Tuesday morning. Willamette Park was a residential neighborhood, quiet, tree-lined, ordinary. She was simply a young mother pushing her 3-year-old daughter in a stroller, getting some fresh air, moving through the kind of morning that feels entirely unremarkable until it isn't. It was around 10 o'clock on January 15th, 1947, when something on an empty lot on South Norton Avenue caught her eye. At first, she thought it was a department store mannequin, a doll discarded, lying in the grass near the sidewalk. The figure was too pale, too still, too perfect in its horrifying stillness to look real. But then she looked closer, and she understood that it was not a mannequin. Betty Bersinger turned away, grabbed her daughter, ran to the nearest house, and called the police. And in the decades that followed, she would never speak publicly about what she had seen that morning. It was the kind of thing you carry in silence. The responding officers arrived within minutes, and what they found on that empty lot on South Norton Avenue was unlike anything the Los Angeles Police Department had ever encountered. Elizabeth Short's body had been positioned on the grass with chilling deliberateness. Placed face up, just inches from the sidewalk, her hands raised above her head, her legs straight. She was completely unclothed. Her body had been divided into two halves, at the waist, and the two halves had been arranged with a space between them, as though posed by someone who had taken their time and wanted the scene to be seen in a particular way. There was not a single drop of blood anywhere on the ground or the surrounding grass. The body had been completely drained of blood, and it had been thoroughly cleaned, washed with extraordinary care, before being placed at this location. This told the investigators something immediately. Elizabeth Short had not been killed here. She had been killed somewhere else. She had been held somewhere else. And then she had been brought here, deliberately and left to be found. Word reached the press almost immediately, and that fact alone would complicate the investigation from the very first hour. Los Angeles in 1947 was a city with multiple competing newspapers that were ferociously aggressive in pursuing sensational stories. Photographers arrived at the scene before investigators had finished documenting it. And reporters began knocking on doors in the neighborhood before detectives could secure witness statements. The crime scene, already limited in terms of usable physical evidence, was further compromised by the sheer volume of people who walked through it in those first chaotic hours. Captain Jack Donahue of the LAPD would later say publicly that he believed the murder had taken place in a remote building or structure somewhere on the outskirts of Los Angeles, and that the body had been transported to South Norton Avenue. But by then, any physical trail connecting the two locations had been thoroughly destroyed, partly by whoever killed Elizabeth Short, and partly by the circus that descended on that quiet residential street. The victim had no identification whatsoever. No purse, no wallet, no clothing, no personal effects of any kind. And the person or people who had brought her to that lot had made certain of that. Investigators needed to know who she was, and quickly. An editor at the Los Angeles Examiner came up with a solution that, for 1947, was genuinely innovative. He suggested that the fingerprints taken from the body be sent via the newspaper's sound photo machine, an early primitive version of a fax machine used by press services, directly to a relay office in Washington, D.C., where they could be transmitted to the FBI. The FBI acted with remarkable speed. In just 56 minutes after receiving those blurred fingerprints, the Bureau had a name: Elizabeth Short, 22 years old. The fingerprints match records on file from her 1943 arrest in Santa Barbara and from a period when she had worked on a United States Army base. She had a mother in Massachusetts. Anna and she had a story, and the entire country was about to hear it. An LAPD detective named Harry Hansen, no relation to Mark Hansen, was assigned as the lead investigator on the case, alongside his partner, Finis Brown. Harry Hansen was a methodical man, experienced, serious. He understood almost immediately that this was not going to be a case that solved itself quickly, if it solved itself at all. An autopsy was performed on Elizabeth Short's body on January 16, 1947, the day after her discovery. The findings were deeply troubling. The cause of death was cerebral hemorrhage resulting from repeated, forceful blows to the face and head. She had been struck again and again across the face. She had also sustained lacerations to the corners of her mouth, cuts that had been made methodically on both sides, extending her mouth outward. And the precision and deliberateness of everything done to Elizabeth Short after her death, the way her body was divided, the way it was cleaned, the way it was arranged, indicated to investigators that whoever had done this possessed either medical knowledge, surgical training, or some equivalent degree of clinical familiarity with the human body. This was not the work of someone who had acted in a moment of uncontrolled fury. This was controlled, practiced, and that made it far more frightening. The press named her almost as quickly as the FBI identified her. The nickname came together from two different directions. One was the 1946 film noir thriller The Black Dahlia, starring Alan Ladd and Veronica Lake, which had been in theaters just months before the murder. At the other was Elizabeth Short's own distinctive aesthetic. Her jet black hair, her preference for black clothing, the dark flowers she reportedly liked to wear. A reporter at the Los Angeles Herald-Express, in the frantic early hours of coverage, coined the phrase the Black Dahlia. By the evening of January 15, 1947, every newspaper in Los Angeles was running it. By the following morning, it was on front pages across the country. Elizabeth Short, who had spent her entire adult life trying to be seen, trying to be somebody, trying to break through into a world that kept its doors just slightly out of reach, was suddenly the most talked about name in America. But not the way she had ever imagined, not even close. Investigators began retracing Elizabeth's final movements with a sense of controlled urgency. They found that after Robert Red Manley had dropped her at the Biltmore Hotel on January 9th, Elizabeth had been seen by a bellman at the Biltmore, sitting in the hotel lobby for several hours. She appeared to be waiting for someone. She used the hotel telephone. She spoke with people. And then somewhere between late afternoon and early evening on January 9th, 1947, Elizabeth Short walked out of the Biltmore Hotel into the Los Angeles dusk. Nobody who came forward had seen her after that. No credible witness could place her anywhere. Not that evening, not the following day, not during the 6 days between January 9th and January 15th, when Betty Bersinger found her body on South Norton Avenue. 6 entire days, and not a single verified sighting of Elizabeth Short anywhere in Los Angeles. She had simply vanished into the city, and the city had given nothing back. Captain Jack Donahue established a dedicated task force almost immediately. At its peak, the investigation would involve approximately 750 investigators from the LAPD and connected agencies, a staggering commitment of resources that reflected both the severity of the crime and the intensity of the public and media pressure bearing down on the department. Every hotel in Los Angeles was canvassed. Every rooming house, every boarding house, every acquaintance Elizabeth Short had made in the city was tracked down and interviewed. Investigators tried to map the last 6 days, tried to find someone who had rented a building, a garage, a room, someone who had purchased large quantities of cleaning supplies, someone who had been seen in the Leimert Park neighborhood in the early morning hours of January 15th. Every lead was followed, and almost every lead dissolved into nothing. The city was enormous, the population transient, and the killer, or killers, had been extraordinarily careful. And then, on January 24, 1947, 9 days after Betty Bersinger's morning walk changed everything, a package arrived at the offices of the Los Angeles Examiner. It had been mailed from somewhere in the city. The outside of the package had been carefully treated with gasoline, which had evaporated, taking any potential fingerprints with it. Inside the package were items that made investigators' blood run cold. Elizabeth Short's birth certificate, her social security card, photographs, business cards, names and addresses written on small pieces of paper, and an address book, its cover intact but with one page cleanly removed, one name deliberately cut out so that investigators would not be able to read it, and a note constructed from letters and words cut from newspaper pages and magazine advertisements and rearranged on paper, just like a ransom note, that read, "Here is Dahlia's belongings, letter to follow." The killer was not hiding. The killer was communicating, and they were doing it with absolute terrifying confidence. The letter that followed, and there were several more communications sent to Los Angeles newspapers in the weeks after, were all constructed the same way. Cut-out letters, no handwriting, no fingerprints. One of them read, "I will give up on the Dahlia killing if I get 10 years. Don't try to find me." Another read, "You would not give me a square deal. A Dahlia killing was justified." These messages were not the ramblings of someone coming apart. They were measured, they were deliberate. They were the communications of someone who believed they were entirely out of reach. Someone who was, in their own mind, completely untouchable. And the LAPD had no way to prove otherwise. Every item in that package had been wiped clean. Every surface that could have held a print had been treated. The gasoline had done its job. The person who sent that package knew exactly what they were doing, and they wanted the police and the city to know that they knew. Robert "Red" Manley was the first person the LAPD brought in as a serious suspect. He was the last confirmed person to have seen Elizabeth Short alive, and in any investigation, that simple fact places a person under immediate and intense scrutiny. Manley was arrested and brought in for questioning within days of the murder. He cooperated fully. He told investigators everything he could remember about his time with Elizabeth Short. The drive from San Diego, the overnight stop, the drop-off at the Biltmore on January 9th. He said their relationship had been friendly but not romantic. He said she had seemed nervous, distracted, as though something was on her mind that she wasn't sharing. He submitted to polygraph examinations. Not once, but twice. He passed both. Investigators ultimately cleared him as a suspect in Elizabeth Short's death, though the process of being brought in, questioned, and publicly associated with one of the most sensational murder cases in American history came at an enormous personal cost. Robert "Red" Manley suffered a mental breakdown in the years that followed and was eventually committed to a psychiatric facility by his wife. He spent the rest of his life trying to escape the shadow of a crime he had nothing to do with. The address book that arrived in that package, the one with the name carefully removed from its cover, gave investigators 75 names. 75 people whom Elizabeth Short had known, met, exchanged information with at some point during her time in Los Angeles. Every single one of those people had to be located, contacted, and interviewed. Some were easy to find. Some had moved. Some had left the country entirely. Soldiers, veterans, men whose lives had taken them to distant places. The process took weeks. Investigators went through each name methodically, looking for something, a connection, a detail, an inconsistency that would crack the case open. When they were done, not a single person from that address book had been charged. Not one. And the name that had been deliberately removed from the cover, the name the killer had taken the trouble to cut out before sending the package, was never definitively identified. Mark Hansen came under the LAPD's scrutiny early. Hansen was a wealthy, well-connected man who owned several nightclubs and theaters in Los Angeles, including the Florentine Gardens, where Elizabeth Short had once worked as a waitress and near which she had rented a room. For a period, Elizabeth had boarded at Hansen's home, one of several young women he allowed to stay there. Witnesses told investigators that Hansen had developed a romantic interest in Elizabeth, and that Elizabeth had declined his advances. When investigators noted that Hansen's name was likely the one removed from the cover of the address book recovered in the package, a detail that, if true, would suggest the killer wanted to protect Hansen or direct attention away from him. Hansen was questioned. He denied involvement. He was never charged. And the question of exactly what Mark Hansen knew about Elizabeth Short's final days and whether anyone in his circle had anything to do with her death remained open, unanswered for decades. By late January and early February of 1947, something extraordinary and deeply disruptive was happening. People were confessing. One by one, men and women were walking into police stations across Los Angeles and eventually across the country, and claiming that they had killed Elizabeth Short. In the first weeks alone, more than 60 people confessed. By the time the initial wave of confessions slowed, that number had climbed past 150. Over the full span of the investigation, across all the years that followed, the total number of people who would claim responsibility for the Black Dahlia murder would eventually exceed 500. 500 confessions? None of them, not one, were considered legitimate by investigators. Some were clearly attention-seeking. Some came from deeply troubled individuals who latched onto the notoriety of the case. A few came from people who had specific details that gave investigators pause, details that were close enough to reality to warrant serious examination. Each of those had to be investigated. Each consumed time and resources, and each one ultimately was ruled out. On February 1st, 1947, just over 2 weeks after the discovery of Elizabeth Short's body, the Los Angeles Daily News ran a headline that captured the state of the investigation with brutal honesty. Case has run into a stone wall. The LAPD had no solid suspect, no crime scene, no witnesses to the actual crime, no physical evidence connecting anyone to Elizabeth Short's final 6 days. Captain Jack Donahue told the press that he believed the murder had taken place in a remote structure somewhere outside the city. A shack, a warehouse, somewhere isolated enough that nobody had heard anything. He believed the body had been transported to South Norton Avenue in the early morning hours of January 15th, placed there carefully, and then the killer had simply driven away. The city was enormous. The streets were mostly quiet at that hour. And there was nobody, not a single person, who had seen a car stop on South Norton Avenue and leave something behind. Meanwhile, the LAPD was under extraordinary pressure. The newspapers were relentless. The Los Angeles Examiner ran front-page stories on the Black Dahlia investigation every single day for 35 consecutive days after the body was found. 35 days. Reporters were following detectives. Witnesses were being contacted by journalists before investigators could reach them. Tips were being printed in newspapers before the LAPD could act on them. The competitive frenzy of the Los Angeles press in 1947 was not simply an inconvenience to the investigation. It actively interfered with it at every turn. Evidence was contaminated. Witnesses were coached or confused by what they had read in the papers before being questioned by police. And the LAPD itself was an institution under enormous political pressure. From the mayor's office, from civic leaders, from a public that wanted answers and was growing increasingly frustrated with the department's inability to produce them. The question of surgical skill was one that the LAPD returned to repeatedly during those early weeks. The way Elizabeth Short's body had been prepared, the precision of it, the cleanliness of it, the medical exactness of how it had been divided, pointed strongly towards someone with formal training. Investigators sought a warrant to examine the University of Southern California Medical School, which was located nearby. Students and faculty were interviewed. Records were reviewed. It was a dead end, but the hypothesis remained. Whoever had done this was not an ordinary person. They had knowledge. They had tools. They had a private space in which to work, and they had the psychological capacity to carry out something deeply methodical and controlled without breaking down. That combination, knowledge, space, psychological control, significantly narrowed the theoretical field of suspects, even when investigators couldn't attach those characteristics to a specific name. The investigation produced one genuinely strange chapter that speaks to both the desperation of the LAPD and the chaos surrounding the case. In late 1947 and into 1948, a man named Leslie Dillon, a bellhop and part-time writer who had a fascination with criminal psychology, contacted the LAPD's consulting psychiatrist, Dr. Joseph Paul DeRiver. Dillon claimed to have information about the Black Dahlia case. He said he knew someone who had committed the murder. Dr. DeRiver, convinced that Dillon himself was the killer operating through a split personality, communicated with him at length and then arranged, through deeply questionable legal means, to have Dillon brought from Florida to Los Angeles. Once there, members of the LAPD's notorious gangster squad effectively detained Dillon in an effort to extract a confession. The whole scheme collapsed when Dillon managed to pass a handwritten note through a window to someone outside, alerting them to what was happening. The supposed suspect friend Dillon had described turned out to be real. A real innocent man with a solid alibi. Dillon sued the city of Los Angeles. He was released without charges. And the whole episode became one of the most embarrassing chapters in the LAPD's handling of the case. By the time 1947 became 1948 and 1948 became 1949, the investigation into Elizabeth Short's murder was losing steam. The trail was cold. Witnesses had moved on, moved away, or moved beyond their memories of that winter. Detectives who had worked the case were being reassigned. The press had moved on to other headlines. And the public, which had been gripped by the case for months, was beginning to accept that it might never be solved. But the LAPD's troubles were not finished. In 1949, a Los Angeles County grand jury was convened specifically to examine law enforcement's handling of the Black Dahlia case, and more than a dozen other unsolved homicides involving young women that had occurred in Los Angeles between 1943 and 1949. And the grand jury's findings were damning. Investigators had been disorganized, politically pressured, and in some cases, strikingly negligent. The LAPD was publicly criticized, and the investigation, such as it still was, continued to go nowhere. It was also in 1949 that a name entered the investigation for the first time, quietly, without public fanfare, without any official announcement. A name that would remain in the shadows for another half-century before it exploded back into public consciousness in one of the most extraordinary ways imaginable. That name was Dr. George Hodel, a prominent Los Angeles physician, a man of extraordinary intelligence, wealth, and social connection, and a man whose own household was, by 1949, becoming the subject of a deeply troubling criminal proceeding. But before we get to what the LAPD knew about George Hodel, and what they may have chosen not to do about it, we need to understand exactly who he was. Because Dr. George Hodel was not a simple man. He was, by almost any measure, one of the most complicated, unsettling, and dangerous figures that Los Angeles in that era ever produced. Dr. George Hodel was born in 1907. He was brilliant in ways that were almost theatrical. He had graduated from the University of California before his 20th birthday. He spoke multiple languages. He was a physician, an intellectual, an art collector, a man who moved with ease through the highest levels of Los Angeles society, hosting parties attended by artists, writers, musicians, and the city's cultural elite. He had a striking physical presence, tall, sharp-featured, commanding. He inspired admiration and fear in roughly equal measure in the people who knew him. His professional reputation was impeccable. His personal life was, to put it gently, enormously complicated. By the late 1940s, George Hodel was effectively living with multiple women simultaneously. his various wives and partners occupying different corners of his life in arrangements that spoke to a man who believed that ordinary rules simply did not apply to him. He had many children, he had many secrets, and he had a capacity for control over the people around him that those who knew him found both remarkable and deeply disturbing. By 1949, George Hodel found himself at the center of a criminal proceeding that should have destroyed him. His teenage daughter, Tamar, accused him of incestuous sexual abuse. She accused him of far worse things than that. She reportedly told people, including her school counselor, that her father was the man who had killed the Black Dahlia. The trial that followed was lurid, public, and devastating in the picture it painted of George Hodel's household. Two witnesses provided testimony that supported Tamar's account. A third witness, one who had originally agreed to testify, suddenly recanted before the trial and refused to come forward. The prevailing theory among investigators was that George Hodel had intimidated that witness into silence. Despite the testimony that was given, despite the picture painted by the proceedings, George Hodel was acquitted. He walked out of that courtroom a free man, and the question of what he had done to his daughter, to others, to Elizabeth Short, walked out with him, she unanswered. But the LAPD was not entirely done with George Hodel. In late 1949 and into 1950, an 18-man task force assembled by the LAPD and the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office took an extraordinary step. They secretly placed electronic listening devices inside George Hodel's home. His house was bugged. His conversations were recorded. And from those recordings, transcripts of which survived in official files and were not publicly known until 2003, investigators captured something that stopped them cold. One evening at 8:25 p.m., George Hodel was recorded in conversation with an unidentified visitor in his home. And in that recorded exchange, he said the following words: "Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia, they couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead." That statement, clear, calm, deliberate, it was captured on tape by an LAPD task force. It was noted in the official file. And then, despite those words, no arrest was made. No charge was filed. No public statement was issued. George Hodel was never brought in for formal questioning in relation to the murder of Elizabeth Short. In March of 1950, Dr. George Hodel left the United States. He traveled first to Hawaii, then eventually to Asia, where he would spend decades living and working. In the Philippines primarily, where he married an upper-class Filipino woman named Hortensia Laguda and built yet another chapter of his extraordinary and deeply troubled life. He was gone, out of the country, out of reach of the LAPD, and the official file on George Hodel as a suspect in the Black Dahlia case was quietly shelved. He lived abroad for 40 years, till he returned to the United States later in his life, and on May 16, 1999, Dr. George Hodel died in San Francisco at the age of 91. He was never formally charged with any crime related to Elizabeth Short. He was never publicly named by the LAPD as a suspect during his lifetime. He died as he had lived, largely insulated from consequences, and the secrets he carried went with him, or so it seemed. Steve Hodel was a retired Los Angeles Police Department homicide detective, a man who had spent his career doing exactly the same work his department had been doing in 1947. He knew how investigations worked. He knew what evidence looked like. He knew how to build a case. And after his father, George Hodel, died in 1999, Steve Hodel began going through his father's personal effects. In a photograph album he found among those effects, he discovered 2 photographs of young women. One of them bore a striking resemblance to Elizabeth Short. The photographs shook him, and they sent him down a path of investigation that would consume years of his life and result in a conclusion that was, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary things any person has ever had to confront. Steve Hodel came to believe, after exhaustive research, after reviewing official files, after consulting independent forensic experts, that his own father had killed Elizabeth Short, that the man who had raised him, who had sat across from him at the dinner table, who had called himself a healer, was the Black Dahlia killer. Steve Hodel published his findings in 2003 in a book called Black Dahlia, Avenger: The True Story. It became a bestseller, and it detonated like a bomb in the world of true crime. in the LAPD and in the city of Los Angeles. Because Steve Hodel was not a sensationalist writer, he was a former homicide detective. He knew the difference between speculation and evidence. And the evidence he assembled was, to put it plainly, formidable. He established that George Hodel had medical and surgical training that matched exactly what investigators had theorized the killer must possess. He established that George Hodel had been a suspect in the LAPD's own files since 1949. Files that had not been publicly known until a Los Angeles Times columnist, Steve Lopez, filed a formal records request after the book's publication and confirmed that George Hodel's name was indeed on the LAPD's original list of serious suspects. As he established that George Hodel had been present in Los Angeles, had moved in overlapping social circles with Elizabeth Short, and had a documented pattern of predatory behavior toward women. And then there was the handwriting. Steve Hodel obtained samples of his father's personal handwriting, letters, notes, documents from George Hodel's private files. He submitted those samples, without identifying whose writing they were, to multiple independent handwriting analysts. He asked those analysts to compare the samples to the notes and communications sent by the Black Dahlia killer to Los Angeles newspapers in 1947. The cut and paste letters and the handwritten elements that appeared in some of the accompanying envelopes. The results stunned him. Multiple analysts, working independently and without knowledge of whose writing they were examining, concluded that the handwriting in the letters was consistent with George Hodel's. It was not conclusive forensic proof by modern legal standards, but it was far more than coincidence. And when combined with the rest of what Steve Hodel had assembled, the medical knowledge, the LAPD suspicion, the recorded statement, the photographs, the geographic and social connection to Elizabeth Short, it formed a picture that was deeply, undeniably troubling. The head deputy district attorney of Los Angeles County at the time, a man named Stephen Kay, reviewed Steve Hodel's research after the book's publication. Kay was not a man given to dramatic statements. He had spent decades in serious prosecutorial work, and after reviewing the evidence Steve Hodel had assembled, Kay declared publicly that in his assessment, the Black Dahlia case had been solved, that George Hodel was the killer. Not everyone agreed. The LAPD detective then officially in charge of the still open Black Dahlia case, Brian Carr, was considerably more skeptical. Carr acknowledged the evidence was intriguing, but maintained that much of it remained circumstantial, that intriguing connections were not the same thing as prosecutable proof. Elizabeth Short's surviving relatives also disputed some of Steve Hodel's claims, particularly regarding the photographs he believed depicted Short. The debate was real and the disagreement was genuine. But something had fundamentally shifted. For the first time in over 50 years, a credible, documented case had been made against a named individual. And that individual had, on tape, and in his own home, suggested that he had done it. There is another suspect who deserves to be mentioned. Not because the evidence against him is as deep or as documented as what Steve Hodel assembled about his father, but because his story represents one of the most disturbing potential threads in this entire case. His name was Leslie Dillon, the same bellhop who had contacted the LAPD in 1947 and ended up at the center of that deeply questionable forced detention. In 2017, a British true crime author named Pugh Eatwell published a book called Black Dahlia, Red Rose: The Crime, Corruption, and Cover-Up of America's Greatest Unsolved Murder. Eatwell's research led her to argue that Leslie Dillon had committed the murder of Elizabeth Short, not independently, but at the direction of Mark Hansen, the nightclub owner whose romantic advances Elizabeth had rebuffed. Eatwell's book described a local motel called the Astor Motel, where the owner had allegedly found one of his rooms in a devastating state the day after Elizabeth's disappearance, and who, having had his own run-ins with police, had cleaned the room rather than report what he had found. The LAPD, Eatwell argued, had known far more about Leslie Dillon than they had ever publicly acknowledged, and had, for reasons connected to the department's own corruption and political entanglements, allowed the trail to go cold deliberately. And then there was one more name, one that entered the case not in 1947, but in 1980, when a detective named John St. John, one of the longest-serving LAPD investigators, brought forward new information about a man named Jack Anderson Wilson. Wilson had been a suspect in a series of violent crimes in Los Angeles in the 1940s, crimes that bore certain similarities to what had been done to Elizabeth Short. St. John claimed that by 1982, he was close to making an arrest in the Short case based on his investigation of Wilson. But on February 4, 1982, Jack Anderson Wilson died in a fire. The investigation died with him, and the Black Dahlia case, which had consumed pieces of so many investigators' lives, absorbed one more dead end and went quiet again. There is something that needs to be said plainly about the Los Angeles Police Department's handling of the Black Dahlia case. Not to condemn an institution wholesale, but because the facts demand it. The LAPD in 1947 was not a neutral body. It was deeply embedded in the political and financial structure of the city, subject to enormous pressure from powerful people, and, as the 1949 grand jury made clear, functionally inadequate in its response to a wave of violent crimes against women in that period. The grand jury found that investigators had been disorganized and in some cases negligent. The investigation into Elizabeth Short's murder was, from the very beginning, compromised by politics, by press intrusion, by interdepartmental chaos, and by what appeared to be a systematic failure to follow through on leads that pointed toward men with money, connections, and the ability to make uncomfortable attention go away. None of that excuses what happened. None of it explains why the man whose voice was recorded on tape in his own home suggesting he had committed this murder was allowed to leave the country and live out his life in peace. But it does help explain how it was possible. The official case file on the murder of Elizabeth Short remains open today. Formally, the LAPD has never closed it. This is not simply a matter of bureaucratic inertia. An open case has implications. It means the case is technically still active. It means that any new evidence, in theory, could still be acted upon. It also means that the department has never had to answer definitively for its failures, because as long as the case is open, it is still, technically, being pursued. In practice, there are no active detectives assigned to it. The witnesses are long dead. The suspects are long dead. George Hodel died in 1999. Leslie Dillon died in 1987. Mark Hansen died in 1964. Robert Red Manley died in 1986. Jack Anderson Wilson died in 1982. Every person who ever moved through the orbit of this investigation has passed from the living world. What remains is paperwork, argument, theory, and the stubborn, aching mystery of 6 days in January 1947 that nobody has ever fully been able to account for. And here is what those 6 days represent. What they have always represented, even if the language used to describe it has shifted over the decades. Elizabeth Short was a young woman with no money, no family nearby, no stable housing, and no institutional protection of any kind. She moved through a world that offered beautiful young women a very specific arrangement. Be charming, be available, be grateful for the attention of men with more power and resources than you, and ask for nothing in return. She was exactly the kind of person, financially precarious, socially dependent, geographically untethered, that predatory people throughout history have identified as safe targets. Not because she was weak. She was, by all accounts, resilient, warm, and genuinely capable, but because the structures around her offered her nothing. No safety net, no advocate, no one watching out for her. And when she disappeared for 6 days and then was found on a sidewalk in Leimert Park, the structures that had failed to protect her in life failed her again, by turning her into a headline, by building a mythology around her death, by giving her a theatrical nickname that eclipsed her actual name and her actual humanity. Elizabeth's mother, Phoebe Short, learned about her daughter's death from a reporter, not from the police. The Los Angeles Examiner had tracked Phoebe down in Massachusetts and called her, telling her only that her daughter had won a beauty contest and that they wanted some background information. Phoebe began talking warmly about Elizabeth, sharing details about her life, before the reporter eventually told her the truth, that her daughter was dead. Phoebe Short's response to this, learning of her daughter's brutal killing from a newspaper reporter who had tricked her into talking, was described by those who witnessed it as one of the most devastating moments in the entire coverage of the case. She had already lost so much. Her husband had abandoned the family, her daughter had drifted across the country, alive in scattered letters and occasional visits. And now this. The person who was supposed to protect and comfort Phoebe Short in that moment. The LAPD never made that call. A newspaper did. And that is the world in which Elizabeth Short lost her life, and it is worth sitting with that. The Black Dahlia case has, in the decades since 1947, generated an enormous cultural afterlife. James Ellroy, the crime novelist who, as a 10-year-old boy in 1958, had lost his own mother to an unsolved murder in Los Angeles, wrote a novel called The Black Dahlia in 1987. It was a work of fiction that nonetheless captured something true and painful about the city and the case. It was adapted into a film by director Brian De Palma in 2006. There have been countless books, documentaries, podcasts, television specials, and magazine features devoted to Elizabeth Short's story. TNT produced a limited series called I Am the Night in 2019, starring Chris Pine, based partly on the George Hodel theory. The case has become, in a way, one of the founding texts of American true crime as a genre. A story people return to because it contains, in compressed and terrible form, so many of the things that have always fascinated and horrified us about crime, about power, about justice, and about the fragility of a young life up against a system that was never designed to protect it. What does it say about us, about this country, about this culture, that we have been telling the story of Elizabeth Short for nearly 80 years and still cannot bring it to a close? Some would say it reflects an admirable commitment to truth, an inability to simply accept injustice and move on. Others would say it reflects something darker, a fascination with the spectacle of violent death that has more to do with entertainment than with accountability. Wait, both of those things are probably true simultaneously, but here is what I believe. I believe that the reason this case will not die is not just because it was never solved. Plenty of cases go unsolved and are eventually forgotten. The reason this case endures is because Elizabeth Short was a real person, with a real mother who grieved her, real sisters who missed her, real friends who remembered her laugh and her smile, and the way she always arrived somewhere new with her suitcase and her hope. And the world has never fully reckoned with what it owed her. What it owed her in life, when it could have built systems that offered vulnerable young women somewhere to turn. And what it owed her in death, when it had the chance to demand answers, and instead settled for a nickname and a mythology. Elizabeth Short was not the Black Dahlia. The Black Dahlia was what the world made of her after she was gone. Elizabeth Short was a girl from Massachusetts who grew up believing her father was dead, who moved across the country looking for something she never quite found, who worked as a waitress and dreamed of being somebody, who made friends wherever she went, who laughed easily, who loved wearing black, who had dark hair and blue eyes, and a smile that people remembered. She was somebody before anyone ever called her the Black Dahlia. She was somebody when she was alive, and she deserved a world that treated her that way while she was here. In the end, the murder of Elizabeth Short is not just a cold case, it is a question, and the question is not only who did it, though that question matters deeply and it remains unanswered. The question is also, what did we decide Elizabeth Short was worth? What did the city of Los Angeles decide? What did the LAPD decide? What did the newspapers decide when they turned her death into a spectacle and gave her a nickname and sold hundreds of thousands of papers with her face on the front page? A young woman was held against her will for 6 days, was killed, and was left on a sidewalk in a quiet neighborhood. And the full force of American society descended on that sidewalk. And somehow, 77 years later, nobody has ever answered for it. That is not just a mystery, that is a failure. And the very least we can do, the very least, is say her name correctly. Not the Black Dahlia. Elizabeth Short, a girl who wanted to be somebody, and who was. And yet, there is one more thing. And one final layer that this case leaves behind, and it is perhaps the most quietly devastating detail of all. When Steve Hodel published Black Dahlia Avenger in 2003, and Los Angeles Times columnist Steve Lopez requested the official LAPD files on the case, what Lopez found confirmed something extraordinary. The LAPD had known George Hodel was a suspect since 1949. They had bugged his home. They had recorded his words. They had assembled a task force. And then they had let it go. The official explanation, such as it is, has always been insufficient evidence. That what they had was suggestive but not prosecutable. That a recorded statement from a man speculating about his own guilt was not enough to take to a courtroom. Maybe that is true. Maybe by the legal standards of 1950, they genuinely could not have won a prosecution. But it is equally possible, and Steve Hodel and Pew Eatwell and others have argued this with considerable documentation, that George Hodel's connections, his wealth, his social standing, and the political dynamics of the LAPD in that era created a situation in which the path of least resistance was simply to watch him leave the country and close the file. There is one detail from Steve Hodel's research that has stayed with me more than any other. One small, quiet, terrible thing. When Steve Hodel found those photographs in his father's album, the photographs he believed depicted Elizabeth Short, he did not know immediately what he was looking at. He had to look closely. He had to compare them to photographs of Elizabeth Short that were publicly available. And slowly, the recognition came. And he was looking at a photograph that his father had kept, privately, personally, in a family album, of a young woman who looked very much like the girl found on South Norton Avenue. And the question Steve Hodel had to sit with, the question that haunts him still, is what it means to have spent your life in law enforcement, dedicated to finding people who do terrible things, and to discover that the person you were looking for was, in some sense, always closer than you knew. That is not a mystery. That is a reckoning. And it is one that the city of Los Angeles and the LAPD and the entire American true crime industry that has grown up around Elizabeth Short's story has never fully completed. The case is still open. The file is still there. The question is still the same one Betty Bersinger implicitly asked when she turned away from that empty lot on South Norton Avenue on the morning of January 15th, 1947, and ran to find a telephone. The same question Elizabeth Short's mother Phoebe asked when a reporter tricked her into talking and then told her the truth. The same question Elizabeth's sisters have carried their entire lives. The same question that investigators, from Harry Hansen in 1947 to Steve Hodel in 2003, have spent enormous pieces of themselves trying to answer. Who did this? And why was no one ever made to answer for it? 77 years, and we are still asking. That in itself tells you everything you need to know about what Elizabeth Short was worth to the world that failed her. So now I want to hear from you. We have been on this journey together for the last hour, and that is exactly what it feels like. A journey, not a Wikipedia summary, not a list of facts, a story. The story of a real person who deserves so much more than the world gave her, and of a system that looked the other way at precisely the moment it was supposed to look hardest. After everything you've heard tonight, the evidence, the suspects, the recorded statement in George Hodel's bugged home, the decades of silence from the LAPD, Steve Hodel's extraordinary reckoning with his own father's legacy, I want to ask you one question, and I want you to answer it honestly in the comments below. Do you believe George Hodel killed Elizabeth Short? And if he did, do you believe the LAPD knew? Drop your answer below. Tell me your theory. Tell me which piece of evidence hit you the hardest. Tell me if there's a detail you noticed that you think deserves more attention. Tell me who you think the world has been overlooking in this case for 77 years. The comment section on this video is going to be one of the most interesting conversations we've ever had, and I genuinely cannot wait to read what you think. This case is the kind of case that gets inside you, and I know you have thoughts. I want to hear them. And if this video gave you something to think about tonight, if it made you feel something, if it made you angry, if it made you want to know more, then it did exactly what it was supposed to do. A like takes 2 seconds. And what it does is tell this platform that stories like Elizabeth Short's deserve to be heard by more people. One that feels like the very least we can do for her. So if this moved you, hit that button. It matters more than you know. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because what's coming next is a case that is going to leave you absolutely speechless. I cannot tell you everything yet. But I will say this, The person at the center of the next story was known to millions of people. Their name was everywhere, and the truth about what happened to them was concealed in plain sight for decades by the people closest to them. You do not want to come in on that one late. Elizabeth Short was 22 years old when she lost her life on or around January 14th or 15th, 1947. She is buried at Mountain View Cemetery in Oakland, California. Her grave has been visited by thousands of people over the decades. Strangers, mostly. Who felt the pull of her story and came to stand quietly for a moment in front of a name carved in stone. Not the Black Dahlia, Elizabeth Short, July 29th, 1924 to January 15th, 1947. A girl who just wanted to be somebody. I'll see you in the next one.